The man in my basement takes one step closer every week. Part 6. Rule 7: the intruder will not move so long as you have guests in the house, guests who actually want to be there. Correct. Where are you? Said Mitch, sounding like he hadn't slept in days. Home, I said, rifling through a box of tools. My phone, set to speaker, sat on the garage floor. You didn't see my calls? Yeah, my bad. Service out here. Look, Brandon. He cleared his throat. I need you to be 100% honest. Did you speak with the neighbor? Yes. A long, draining silence followed and then click. Mitch ended the call. Shaking my head, I went back to searching for tools right now. I didn't have the time to worry about Mitch. First, I needed to barricade the basement door. Second, I needed to call every single person in my contact list and offer them the spare bedroom. Rent-free. Digging through a tangled mess of tools, my hand finally gripped around a famother and lawyer. Smooth, wooden handle. Out from the box, I pulled a hammer. Bingo. Resting on a single crutch, I stood at the basement door, pounding nail after nail into scraps of 2x4s and whatever else I could find. Unlike Paul, I didn't have the knowledge or the resources to build an apocalyptic bunker door. So, this makeshift zombie defense would have to do for now. Hammering away faster and faster, I once again fell into a strange calm. A meditative peace that father-in-lawed every breath with purpose, and my hand slipped. The hammer slammed into my pointer finger and throbbing pain shot up my arm. Cursing through my teeth, I clenched my hand tight. The hammer fell to the floor and dented headfirst into the hardwood. Ducking idiot. Ducking idiot. Stupid ducking idiot. My thoughts exploded into a tirade of self-abusive screaming. A few seconds went by, and the pain numbed. My thoughts cleared. I took in 3 slow breaths and squat down to pick up the hammer. I froze. Through the bottom crack of the door. The basement light was on. I honestly couldn't remember if I'd turned it off or not, but the light being on didn't bother me. Not anymore. Not after everything I'd seen. What bothered me was the dark shadow stood on the other side of the door, flanked by orange glow. That, and the sound of breathing, barely audible, but unmistakable, labored, strained, and rattling, like an empty bottle of spray paint. Suddenly, the door strained forward slightly, as if hands pressed against the other side. Breathing deep, I gripped my hand around the hammer and rose to standing. I turned my head and pressed my ear flat against the door, listening. The intruder was whispering. Ducking idiot, he gasped, quick and stuttering. Stupid ducking idiot. Labored breathing continued all the while, almost as if it were 2 separate voices. He was repeating my earlier thoughts aloud, right down to every random intrusion. Dent in the floor, dent. Dent in the floor. Lights on. Turn them off. The whispering continued. Is that breathing? I think breathing. House. Correct. Basement. Dent in the floor, dent. I'd heard enough. I stepped back, shook my hand out, lined up another nail, and hammered away. It's not real, I told myself. It's all inside of your head. Finally, I slammed the last nail into the last board. I took 4 steps back, and marveled at the ramshackle creation. It wasn't pretty, but it got the job done. My eyes flicked involuntarily to the bottom of the door. The light was off. No more whispering. Thank God. Wiping my forehead, I turned back towards the living room and slumped onto the couch. I took out my phone, and pulled open my contact list. Time to find a willing guest. 2 hours later, dialing number after number, straight to voicemail after straight to voicemail. And not a single bite. Correct. Only one person actually answered. A roommate from college. I'd be more than down, he said, but I am up in Canada now. Of course, maybe I'd have to put up an ad on Craigslist. Duck. I tucked my phone away, just about ready to give up when 3 small knocks at the front door. I already knew who it was. Pushing up from the couch, I grabbed my crutches, marched across the room, and pulled open the door. Hey Brandon. There stood Howie, dressed in a red sweater, red jeans, and wearing a green backpack, looking a little less chipper than usual. Hey Howie, I said, trying my best to act normal, despite the fact a living nightmare stood behind the basement door mere feet away. Howie, despite all his quirks, was a sight for sore eyes. Sure, I didn't trust him, but at least he wasn't Mitch or Paul. Yeah, so this is kind of awkward, but I am wondering if I could crash here for a couple days, he said. I can sleep on the couch, pay rent, whatever. No worries if not, he shrugged. I looked back over my shoulder, then back to Howie. Sure. Immediately, he pushed past me, strolled across the room, threw his backpack on the floor, plopped down onto the living room couch, and kicked up his feet. What's with the door? He said, pointing at the barricaded basement door. Pulling the front door shut, I stepped forward. It's an art project. I lied. Replacing the door frame soon anyways. Huh, said Howie, clearly not buying it. The Carver kid been bothering you still? No. I lied again. No man in the basement corner yet, said Howie, chuckling. I forced a half-hearted laugh. Ha. Nope. That's good, said Howie, turning back to the TV. Where's the remote? Howie's sudden arrival was suspiciously convenient at best, and outright malicious at worst. But right now, I didn't have time to think about that. If the rules held, his being here would at least buy me some time to figure out how to stop all this. Maybe I'd sell the house, maybe I'd defer ownership back to the bank, but judging by the no third parties rule, I doubted either of those would actually work. So far, the only people who knew about the intruder were Mitch and his father. And according to Mitch, he didn't count as third party because he already believed. But Paul, his father, that part was getting to me. Something was missing. Paul's whole fix your life, fix your problems spiel bothered me, but something else bothered me more. And I didn't know what it was. Like that feeling you get when you're about to leave home, and you know you've left something important behind. Like an unscratchable itch. I offered Howie the spare room, but he preferred the couch. I didn't fight him on it. I wanted to keep him here as long as possible. Didn't even ask why he needed to stay. It was kind of nice to not be alone in the house for once. Even with Howie. At 9:30, Howie fell asleep watching Jeopardy reruns. I muted the television and went upstairs. Tomorrow, I'd plan my next steps, but right now, I needed to sleep. I climbed into bed and flicked the light off. A bump in the night snapped me awake. A heavy thud like somebody hit their fist against a wall. I checked the time, 2:58 a.m. I climbed out of bed and, hopping on one leg, pulled on a dirty t-shirt and a pair of jeans. I tucked my chrome switchblade into my back pocket. Another thud from downstairs, heavier than the last. What was Howie gonna say about this? I grabbed my crutches, carefully moved down the stairs, and peered into the living room. The blue glow of muted television cast over everything. Howie was still fast asleep on the couch. Thump. The basement door shook this time, like somebody had slammed their forehead against it. I backstepped away, deeper into the living room. Howie was still out like a rock. Heavy sleeper. Thump. Okay. I told myself to breathe. Remember the rules, barricading the door will slow him down. But it'll be loud. That's all this was. I'll put in some earplugs and blast white noise and fall asleep. Turning back towards the kitchen, I stepped across the room as quiet as possible. Last thing I wanted was for Howie to wake up and start asking more questions. Thump. This time the hardwood floors beneath my feet shook. I froze. My eyes drifted back to Howie, still asleep, his face motionless, serene almost. I turned back for the kitchen. Either Howie was the world's heaviest sleeper, or he couldn't hear the sounds at all. Stepping into the kitchen, Brandon. A small, muffled voice called out from behind the door. I looked back over my shoulder towards the basement door. Brandon. The voice repeated, slightly deeper now. I turned around and faced it head on. Brandon. From behind the basement door, the voice strained, sympathetic. Brandon. The voice repeated my name again and again, each time sounding completely different, like a slot machine shuffling through different tones until it hit the right one. You in there? It was getting famother and lawyer now. You okay? Suddenly, the voice shifted into a perfect mimic of my late father, gently knocking, the same way father did to my bedroom door after Zach, my best and only childhood friend, died. A memory that, until now, I did my best to ignore. After Zach died, I biked home, sat on my bed, and stared blankly at the vinyl closet doors for 6 hours straight, eyes tracing every path of the wood grain pattern again and again. The entire world outside, dissolving into nothing. The starscape painted wall somehow pushing closer and closer. I am here if you need to talk, kid. My father called out, one last time. For a second, I forgot it was the intruder speaking. For a second, I actually believed it was Dad there, gently knocking on the basement door. Silence. Lingering silence stretched on for minutes while I just stood there, barely breathing, eyes locked on the basement door, paralyzed. Finally, my lungs forced me to gasp in air. Oxygen flooded into my brain, and awareness came rushing back. I looked around. On TV played a silent infomercial about some vegetable blender thing, and Howie was still fast asleep. I shook out my hands, went back into the kitchen, opened the drawer beside the fridge, and pulled out a pair of orange earplugs. It's not real, I told myself again, trying to take Paul's advice. I slid the drawer shut. It's all inside of your head. But again, the words fell flat, like empty platitudes after a funeral. I am sorry for your loss. I am sorry for your loss. I am sorry for your loss. I turned back across the living room and crutched my way onto the stairs. Time to sleep. Brandon. I was halfway up the stairs when a different voice called out from behind the basement door. This time a teenager's voice. Strange yet famother and lawyer. Duck this. I kept walking. Brandon. The voice repeated. This time tinged with fear. This time, entirely famother and lawyer. I wanted to keep walking away. I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Long forgotten memories came rushing back. Memories of Zach. Memories I ignored and shoved away because it was easier to pretend they never happened. It was easier to do everything in my power to ignore the dread, than to face it head on. It was easier to pretend Zach never even existed. Brandon helped. Zach's voice quivered. Terrified. Something's down here, he whispered. Brandon. He pulled at the door handle, and the door shook. Brandon. Zach whimpered. the fear in his voice growing each time he spoke. Brandon, open the door please. He pulled at the handle again. Harder this time. Brandon, please. Open the door. He banged a fist against it. Brandon. I am sorry, Brandon. His voice trailed off into sobbing whimpers. And he slid down the door, muffled weeping. An image crawled into my thoughts. The image of Zach. Gray hoodie pulled over his head, curled up into a ball, weeping at the top of the basement stairs. Silence. A sudden and shrill scream of terror. Primal. Almost inhuman. Followed by the quick thumping sound of a body dragged over stairs. Screaming and pleading all the while. Drugged downstairs. Down the hallway. Into the rec room. Kicking and screaming and begging. Up from the basement. Echoing through a vent in the wall next to my ear. I am sorry. Another voice. Not Zach's voice. Not my father's voice. A voice I didn't recognize. Panicked and remorseful. I am sorry, Zach. Zach, I'm so sorry. I can't. I don't. The sickening sound of bone cracked against concrete. Like a tree. Branch snapping in the wind. The percussive beat of skull against stone. Again and again and again. Zach's whimpering shrieks for help turning more unintelligible with every impact. Even worse. The person killing him was profusely and sincerely apologizing all the while. I am sorry, oh God, I am so sorry. Zach. Sudden silence. 5 seconds or 5 minutes. I didn't know. Only silence. Silence and then sniffling whimpers. Not Zach's voice. Not my father's voice. The voice of who I assumed was the intruder. Crying. Almost sobbing. Oh no, it moaned. Father-in-law with unimaginable guilt. Oh God, I am sorry, I am so sorry, it wailed. Then I heard it drop to its knees, and fall to its side, and maybe curl up into a ball, and trail off into pitiful, whimpering sorrow, unimaginable grief. This went on for several minutes until, finally, more silence, sniffling. The sound of somebody standing up, the sound of somebody dragging a body against concrete, deeper and deeper into the basement, quieter and quieter as if the rec room stretched on further than it should, further and further away until nothing. Dazed in a trance, I wandered up the stairs and into my bedroom. I pulled the door shut, stuck my earplugs in, and crawled into bed. I shut my eyes, and a sudden realization flooded over me. Coat rack. Finally, I understood the nagging itch in the back of my head. A realization so obvious, I hated myself for not getting it sooner. I burst into laughter. Not happy laughter. Not funny laughter. Insane. Compulsive laughter, curling into a ball on my bed. I turned onto my side and stared at the fake cherrywood vinyl closet doors. The doors that reminded me of my childhood bedroom. My eyes traced along the paths of wood grain patterns and the words of Paul played through my head all the while. Take that coat rack out past city limits and douse it in gasoline and burn it. I told Paul a lot of things, but I never told him about the coat rack. Rule 1: he will begin in the furthest corner of your basement. If you see him, do not overreact. He may decide to move on. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the bedroom window, trailing downward, a pointless race to the bottom, large drops consuming the smaller. I sat up and stared at the shut closet doors. I sighed, still exhausted, the horrific sounds of last night echoing in my head. Zach's whimpering screams for help. Reaching for my crutches, I stopped short. Water. A small puddle on the windowsill. I pushed up to standing and crushed over. Water dripped off the windowsill and onto the floor. I wiped my hand against it. Cloudy white droplets clung to my fingertips. I ran another hand along the edges of the window seam until it caught a snag. More water. The window seal was broken. Yet another expense I didn't have the money for. Great. Wiping my hand off on my shirt, I turned back around when another memory entered my head: the dripping sound in the basement. The puddle of water and clumps of wet dirt in the basement corner. What exactly was that about? I grabbed my other crutch and went downstairs. I didn't know for sure yet, but I had a theory. Howie's green backpack sat in the middle of the living room floor. Howie, I said. No response. I shrugged. Moved into the kitchen. Maybe he went out for the day. Either way, my curiosity was getting the better of me once again. The basement was inviting me down. One last time, I stood there, thinking about puddles and coat racks, ruminating. I never specifically mentioned the coat rack to Paul. Sure, there's a chance he could have overheard me talking with Mitch, but that seemed unlikely. Maybe he really was possessed by the man in the basement. Maybe I really am completely insane. Maybe I'm trapped in a madness triggered by Mitch's note and a misplaced coat rack, but that almost seemed crazier than the actual situation. Regardless, I needed to investigate the basement. One last time. Easier said than done. I couldn't go through the main door, thanks to the barricade and the intruder standing there. But thankfully, one of the spare rooms had a window. A small window in a cramped window well. But a window nonetheless. Hopefully, the few extra quarantine pounds wouldn't prevent me from squeezing through. Hopefully. I brought my trusty switchblade and a pencil-sized high-powered flashlight. I'd be going in dark because the light switch was on the stairs and, as I mentioned before, so was the intruder. No way was I going anywhere near him. Sure, I wasn't thrilled at the prospect of going back down, but according to the rules, the intruder wouldn't hurt me. Not yet. I crouched down into the gravel window well, Moving around with one leg was getting a little easier, but I still needed crutches. Through the window, I slid my crutches in first and they clattered to the floor, a little louder than I've liked. I waited, listening for a reaction. Nothing. Feet first. I pulled myself through and stepped down into the room. A room no bigger than a walk-in closet, crowded with unopened boxes. Why did I have so much stuff? Squatting down, I picked up my crutches. It's not real, I told myself once again, flicking the flashlight on at no light. Are you ducking kidding me? I literally changed the batteries 5 minutes ago. I shook the light. Nothing. I smacked it with the palm of my hand. And finally, it flickered to life. Thank duck. I was starting to feel like a Silent Hill video game character. Clunky walking controls included. Lovely. Flashlight between my teeth. I crouched across the room, deeper into the basement. My hand gripped around the doorknob, and I froze. The stupidity of me being down here again suddenly hit me. Was this really such a good idea? I glanced back at the open window, inviting sunlight cast into the room. The peaceful sound of rain, patting against gravel. Duck it. I turned back for the door. I still don't know why, but something told me the water in the basement corner would answer many questions. Maybe everything. Father-in-law with bitter resolve. I clenched my fist around the doorknob, turned it, and gently pushed open the door with my knee. Okay. I stepped out into the hallway. It was quiet down here. Unnaturally quiet. Like the world behind me suddenly vanished into non-existence. Like the basement itself was now the entire universe. I turned leftward, the light between my teeth cast into the distant stairwell corner. Empty. Thank God. I turned rightward. The cold concrete rec room greeted me. Uninviting as always. Even before all this, the rec room creeped me out. There was something about hallways that led to rooms with blind corners on either side. Anything could be hiding there, waiting to jump out at you as you stepped in. The random stacks of cardboard boxes didn't help either. I crunched forward. Shadows on the rec room's back wall lurched up and down with each forward step. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any possible movement, any sign of the intruder. I stepped into the rec room and swivel-checked the corners. Nothing. Everything motionless. So still. It almost felt like the room was on pause. A thin layer of dust covered all. I crouched forward again, and my cast-covered leg bumped into a stack of precarious boxes. A stack of boxes that collapsed into another stack of boxes and then another one. Stupid ducking idiot. The tumbling crash of random objects slamming into the concrete floor. Fool of a took. I tensed up, bracing for the noise to end. Finally, the domino cacophony stopped. Silence returned. I looked back over my shoulder, casting light into the stairwell corner. Still empty. Good. I half expected something terrible to be stood there. Something incomprehensibly monstrous. I waited with held breath. Waited for the intruder to stagger down the steps. But nothing happened. Not even the sound of breathing. Not even the smell of burnt hair. Okay. I turned around and crept towards the back corner. I squatted down and studied. It was the same corner where the water had dripped a few nights back. Dry now. I looked up. Pink insulation and pipes. Maybe it really was just a leak. Maybe I came all the way back down here for nothing. I was about to stand back up when something caught my eye. Dust. Or rather, a lack of dust. A perfectly dustless square in the corner of the concrete wall. About 3 feet by 3 feet. I leaned in close and squinted. There was a hair-thin line in the concrete. A crack. Only visible from the perfect angle. A thin line forming the shape of a square. Like someone had cut into the concrete with a laser. Almost reflexively. I placed my hand against the dustless square and pushed. The panel shifted backward with a satisfying click. Then, it shifted forward and slid to the side, revealing an entrance. An entrance barely big enough to crawl through. I looked back over my shoulder, shining the flashlight at the door to the rec room. Still nothing. I turned around and crouched down further. The entrance led to a tunnel, a long straight tunnel with dirt walls, dirt floors, and strained beams holding it all together. Unsafe, to put it mother-in-lawly. It went for about 20 feet, then took a hard turn to the right. A hard turn directly towards Paul's house. A tunnel, connecting our basements. I barely even registered what I was seeing when the basement light flicked on. My eyes flinched shut as they reacted to the sudden light. I spun around, eyes opened. Still nothing. Time to leave. I pushed up to standing and crouched back towards the hallway. The basement light flicked off again. Darkness. Duck this. I picked up speed, hauled down the hallway, shoulder pushed back into the spare room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Taking a deep breath, I stepped away from the door, spun around, and shoved my crutches through the open window, hoisting myself through. I scrambled out of the window. I crawled away and lay on my back on the wet lawn. Freedom. Catching my breath, I stared up at gray skies, rain dotting against my face. Suddenly, my phone buzzed to life. I pulled it out. 1 missed call. Unknown number. Voicemail. 1 message. I tapped into voicemail and held it up to my ear. Hey Brandon, it's Paul. I'd like to set things straight. Call me back when you get a chance. I haven't been fully transparent with you. No shit. Throughout all this, I kept thinking about my childhood friend, Zach. They never found his body. The only thing they found was a green bicycle. Mangled, twisted, and stained with blood and guts. Hit and run. According to police, likely a semi-truck that didn't even know at first. Some driver, driving for mother-in-law's, oblivious to the mess of gore, stuck to the front of his truck, drove all the way to the next brake stop. It's more common than you'd think. The driver probably got spooked, cleaned the gore off his truck, lied to himself, and said it was just a deer or something. And that's that. I never bought it. Back when I still cared, I was convinced something else was at play, something incomprehensibly terrible. But considering the lack of evidence, it was the most likely explanation. At least, that's what they told me. It took me over 10 years to finally accept the given explanation. That was the first step to moving on. After that, I finally stopped thinking about Zach every day. Sometimes, I didn't think about him for weeks, even months, up until the intruder's mocking theatrics. I'd barely thought about Zach for years, and that was fine by me. Anything to get a good night's sleep. But now, memories of Zach played through my head like half-remembered dreams. Like the time he jumped from his second-story bedroom onto the trampoline, and his mom screamed at us from the living room. The time we stayed up all night playing Super Mario Bros. When my dog died, and Zach came over, and didn't say anything, didn't try to make me feel better. He just sat with me, and that's all I needed. I didn't have a real friend before Zach, and I haven't had one since. I agreed to meet with Paul in a public park. My plan was simple: let him do all the talking. Hopefully learn something along the way. At this point, it didn't make much sense to confront Paul on anything. I'd only bring up the coat rack if needed. I still didn't even know if Paul was Paul, but that didn't matter right now. Gray skies above. Paul sat on a park bench overlooking a duck father-in-law pond. Reddish-orange autumn leaves carpeted over muddy grass. I approached from behind. Paul. He looked back over his shoulder. Breathing fog. Let's go for a walk. We trudged down the path, boots crunching against the gravel. You know I struggled with drinking. Right, said Paul. I nodded. I told you the first time I saw the intruder was in the basement. Yeah, well, that wasn't entirely accurate. I did see him once before that. Way back in '81. Holly and I, not married yet, were camping, out in Utah, La Salle Mountains. He stopped talking and looked around as if to make sure nobody else was too close. Satisfied, he continued. So there was this area, not far from the main campsite. Bunch of caves, not caves like tunnels or whatever you think. More like a pile of giant boulders overgrown with trees and moss, and tiny spaces between the boulders. Crevices, some of them big enough to crawl through. Yellow signs up: no climbing. Paul suddenly stopped talking. Up ahead, on the gravel path, a tall man with a scarf wrapped around his lower face strode toward us. He was heading straight for Paul. Vaguely mother-in-law. His boots crunched against the gravel. Faster and faster until he strode right past us as if we weren't even there. Paul looked back over his shoulder, waiting for a safe distance before continuing. So we're out by these caves, and I was drinking, more than I should have been. And Holly, we're jumping from boulder to boulder. Having fun, why no? But some of those rocks must have been over 40 feet tall. So we reached this one crevice, a bit wider than the rest, a sheer drop about 20 feet down, getting thinner and thinner right up to a slit of darkness below. Holly jumps it first. No problem. I jump it next, and my foot slips. He stopped walking for a moment, thinking back, remembering. Part of me wanted to cut him off, burst into accusations, but another part just wanted to know what happened. He trudged onward, so I tumbled over backward, head first into this crevice. My skull slams against the wall, and I black out. Come to about 20, maybe 30 seconds later, and I can barely breathe. My body's wedged between the boulders, my chest squeezed down on either side, my neck twisted and viced between the walls. I was stuck, upside down and looking straight into the darkness below. He stopped walking again, and his eyes drifted towards a nearby bench. You mind if I sit? I didn't respond. Paul strolled over and slumped down onto the bench, staring out over the pond. His cold blue eyes snapped back and forth over the water. I squatted down on the path in front of him, resting my elbows on my knees. A shimmering breeze crept over the pond and a wet leaf stuck to the back of my head. I pulled it out, and tossed it back into the wind. So I am stuck, he continued, upside down, head first, wedged between these two giant boulders, blood rushing, ears ringing out, gasping in little sips of air as my vision blurs in and out. Holly's above, screaming down, asking if I am okay. But I can't answer, I can barely breathe. I try speaking, but only muffled whimpers escaped. You ever had a nightmare where you scream for help, but your voice just falls back into your throat? Again, I didn't respond. So Holly, she can see my feet twitching down there, so she knows I am still alive, and she yells down. She's gonna get help, tells me to try and stay awake. This was pre-cell phones, mind you, though I doubt there'd been service out there anyway. He sniffed a little and wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. So now, I am stuck out here, completely alone. Sun's still out, but it's getting dark. I am in the shadows anyway. I can't really describe the terror of it, being stuck like that. He looked away. I am doing everything I can to stay calm, trying to focus on what little breath I had. There's this thing I learned, back in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's called 4x3. It helps you calm down. Name 3 things you can see, hear, feel, smell. So I start making notes of my surroundings: green moss, gray rocks, shadowy crevice. He paused again, then looked directly at me. And that's when I saw him, or at least the faintest outline. My eyes were still adjusting, but down below, about 10 feet away, something was there. He went silent, his pupils daughter-in-law-ing, as if he was back in the dark. At first, I thought it was a shape in the rocks, maybe optical illusion. Why no? All I could see was the faint shape of this body, and the glint of what might be eyes. So maybe it was nothing. But as my vision adjusted, the whole picture came into view. Still dark, still covered in shadow, but unmistakable now. A man was down there, his body contorted and twisted, wedged between the crevice, motionless, so ducking still, almost stiller than the rock, like a circus contortionist, hiding down there, waiting for me. Paul shook his head like a chill went down his spine. His face was father-in-law with absolutely nothing. Cold eyes, dead eyes, like shark eyes. Again, Paul looked straight at me. Maybe it's a body, I thought, trying to make sense of it. Maybe somebody fell down here before me. Not much of a comfort, but better than somebody hiding there. But then Paul cleared his throat. His face was changing so slow it was almost imperceptible. Like the sun moving. You can't see it actually move. But next thing you know, it's over there. His blank face, shifting to a portrait of pure terror. He was mirroring my inner emotion. My heart beat faster, thumping against the rock with every pump. My vision fading as all the blood in my body drained downward until I was about to pass out. I welcomed it, and then everything went dark. Paul grimaced regretfully. When I came to, I wasn't stuck between the rocks anymore. I was biking, green bicycle, riding a green bike down the side of a highway at night, and I wasn't myself. I was somebody else. He paused, looked over at me. I tried to maintain a neutral expression, but it was hard considering how crazy his story was getting. It's crazy, I know. But I was trapped behind somebody else's face, almost like it was a mask. I could even feel their thoughts, their memories. Then everything went dark again. I appeared behind the eyes of somebody else now. Some guy wandering around a shopping mall at night. Some washed up stranger. Father-in-law with bitter self-hatred. I can still feel his sadness sometimes. His regret. Then darkness. This kept happening. Again and again. A clusterduck of random visions. Seemingly connected. But always looking out through other people's eyes. Some mother and lawyer. Most strangers. Past. Present. Future. I saw things. Incomprehensible contradictions. It could have been 5 minutes. But it felt like eternity. Like I lived multiple lifetimes. Like this was always my existence and always would be. It's hard to explain how terrifying it was. Maybe cause it doesn't make any sense. Paul rubbed his jaw, thinking. Everything before my life with Holly. Fishing on a summer weekend. Playing with my kids. It was all nothing but a thin sheet that might be ripped away at any second. Paul shifted his weight. I can't explain why, but that strange message was so clear. Like my entire life had been a dream. And I'd just woken up in the real world. A world where I didn't exist. There wasn't a shred of doubt in my mind. He paused for a moment. Then, I woke up in an ambulance, back in my own head. Hysterical. Screaming and wailing about the man tucked between the rocks like a spider. Ranting and raving about the visions. Holly and the paramedics were doing everything they could to calm me down. Keep me from hurting myself. Finally, they ended up sedating me. I dozed off until the hospital. He wiped his mouth. Concussion. Minor cuts. Bruises. He chuckled. All that for that. Doctor told me it's common for concussed people to hallucinate, especially considering the lack of oxygen and me being upside down for such a long time. He told me about a fellow who almost drowned once. Thought he saw the Easter bunny in the water. I've always been scientifically minded, so that made sense to me. Brains play weird tricks. Hallucination made more sense than some circus contortionists sneaking down there just to duck with me, and visions of other worlds, other people. Paul sighed, leaned forward, and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked at me as if that was all he had left to say. I was about to speak when, I am guessing you found the tunnel. Huh, he said plainly. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Paul nodded, pushed up from the bench, and walked down the path. I followed. Yeah, I meant to tell you about that. He mother-in-lawed grimly. So, after I tried shooting the intruder, all those years back, he rubbed the knuckle stub where his pinky finger used to be. Things got bad. Really bad. The ducker started taking steps forward every other day. Sometimes every single day. Tried many things to slow him down. But the only things that worked, the maze and the bunker door. Had some friends from the army help me with that. Told them I was building a doomsday bunker. He shook his head. I was a medic in the war. Did I ever tell you that? Again. I didn't respond. I was doing everything in my power to stay calm. Of course, Holly and I were already on thin ice. And then I shot my own finger off. He smirked. Building an apocalypse maze bunker was the cherry on top. She took the kids and left, which, honestly, was fine by me. I didn't want my father-in-law around the intruder anyways. Or around me. For that matter. I was still painfully aware of the fact that I might just be completely insane. He stopped walking for a moment, looking around again. He continued, but her leaving that really kicked me into gear. I forced myself to stop drinking. I started getting help. Professional help. Started taking meds. The right meds. And sure enough, things actually got better. The bunker door seemed to be keeping the intruder at bay. Sure, he was loud as hell banging on it every night, but I wore earplugs, blasted white noise, and that was good enough. Weirdly, I was almost at peace with his being there. Paul sighed, breathing out fog as we walked along the path. Then one night, maybe 6, 7 months after Holly left, I wake up, and it's quiet. Dead quiet. No banging on the door. No screaming and howling from the basement. Just nothing. That silence father-in-lawed me with a fear worse than anything I'd felt before, getting stuck between those boulders included. It terrified me for a few reasons. First, it made me wonder what he was up to. Second, I'd gotten so used to the sound, I couldn't even sleep without it in a twisted way. The intruder had given me a purpose, something to reckon with. And now he was gone. Paul looked up at the gray autumn skies, squinting as diffused sunlight cast against his face. So a few weeks of nothing go by. And then, on a Sunday afternoon, Holly calls me up out of nowhere. I guess she heard through the grapevine that I was doing better, getting help. She asked me how I was doing, asked me if I wanted to get coffee, maybe see a movie. Can you believe that? Just like how we met. She asked me out, back in those days, smother-in-lawing. Paul shook his head. I said that'd be nice. Said next Tuesday'd be alright. Paul went silent as if considering his next words carefully. Then I set the phone down, and turned around, and there, set in the middle of the living room floor, a bottle of cognac. He scoffed. Unopened. Paul rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. I was sober for over half a year at this point, but I drank the whole thing. He glanced over at me, catching the judgment in my eyes. He looked back down the path. I drank it 'cause it was there. He shrugged. And then I get the brilliant idea to go check on the intruder. Just see what he'd been up to. I'd only ever tried to kill him once, and that backfired. Paul chuckled, but my shit-faced brain got some ideas in it. And I, drunk as hell, staggered downstairs, lurched open the bunker door, and tumbled inside. But there's nothing down there. No stack of boxes. No circus contortionist. Nothing. So I stagger further, down through the maze all the way to the back corner. And there it is, a tunnel, dug into the basement corner, barely big enough to crawl through. At first, I assumed he was setting to wrap back around into my house. So I lost my mind. I scrambled back upstairs, planning to come back down with the 9 mother-in-law again and try God knows what. Paul started walking faster now. And then I go upstairs and there he is, standing in the dead center of the living room, right where the bottle of cognac was, covering his face with his hands, like a kid trying to hide. And that's when I finally ducking noticed it. On his left hand, the 5th finger was cut off short at the first knuckle. Paul held up his own hand. Everything suddenly clicked. He snapped his fingers with surprising loudness. I didn't know why, and I still don't know why, but he's connected to me, and in my head. The only way to stop it was to. He trailed off into somber silence. Still drunk as duck and not thinking straight. I get into my old pickup truck, and peel off down the hill, up the number 7, and I just drive. I drove past Old House, up through Merchant, and kept going. I knew exactly where I was headed. Pedal to the floor the whole way there. Finally feeling like everything made sense. Like every single little thing in my entire life was building towards this. Paul went quiet as a father-in-law of 4 strolled past. So I keep driving. He continued. Faster and faster up towards the Balry cliffs, whipping round every corner like a high-speed chase until I screeched to a stop. Nearly slammed my face against the steering wheel. High beams casting over a long stretch of empty road. Everything pointing towards the Balry Point lookout. He stopped walking and stared straight ahead, as if he was back in the truck, looking down a long stretch of road. I shifted back into gear, slammed my foot into the pedal, and the tires spun out against the pavement a few seconds before they caught, and the truck lurched forward, hauling faster now, straight towards the cliff's edge, city lights below casting up, into the night above. I shut my eyes. Any second now I'd be sailing through the air and, again, he snapped his fingers. Everything crumpled into a crashing stop. My head snapped forward and smothered into latex airbag. The stench of plastic and booze and gasoline. He paused for a moment, eyes flicking back and forth across the path ahead. Turns out the city installed stopping posts on the cliff edge. Guess I wasn't the first, said Paul. Front bumper falling off. I drove all the way back home. It was nearly bright out by the time I got there and the intruder was gone. Paul started walking again. I latched up the bunker door and didn't go back down for years, the whole time expecting any day now he'd come pushing up through the floor, but it never happened. Paul shrugged. Look, I know it's a lot of talking, but all this to say I can help you pass this off to somebody else. I shook my head, tired of the games, tired of the workarounds, the same way you pass this off to me. I mean, it wasn't intentional, but yes, more or less. He might still be coming for me though. I don't know. Look, you don't need to decide right away. How far along is he? Top of the stairs, but still in the basement. Yes. Do you have a guest over? Yes. Make sure they stay away from him. You barricaded the door. Yes. Good. Take some time to think about it. Even if he gets out of the basement, there are other ways to pass him off. More impersonal ways. Also, don't be freaked out if you see him upstairs. Even with the door barricaded, he can do that, but he'll always set back to where he left off. All of Paul's meandering still didn't explain his inexplicable knowledge of the coat rack. I almost brought it up, but stopped short. Maybe Mitch was right. Maybe the intruder really did get to Paul. Maybe Paul wasn't even aware. Part of me wanted to take up Paul's offer. Part of me wanted to bunker barricade the basement door and pass off my problems to somebody else, move away and pretend none of this ever happened. But I didn't. I wish I could say it was out of some bedrock moral principle. But mainly, I refused Paul because I didn't trust Paul. I doubt Paul even trusted Paul. So far, I was adding pieces to an ever-evolving clusterduck of a jigsaw puzzle. The more I learned, the less sense everything made. Part of me wondered if that was the point. If the chaos and confusion was part of the game. Maybe the intruder thought it was funny. Still, the main question remained: is there a way to stop the intruder without passing it off to somebody else? My car rattled as it droned down the number 7 highway. I was on my way back home from the meeting with Paul, and it was already dark out. I needed to get home and sleep. Then a strange feeling came over me. A pressure in my forehead. Not quite painful, but incredibly uncomfortable. Not a migraine either. It felt like a thin sheet of something suddenly appeared behind the skin of my forehead, pressing against my skull. I could almost feel my face pulling tighter. I rubbed my forehead with the back of my arm and something big darted out onto the road in front of me. My foot slammed on the brakes, and my car swerved into a screeching drift. Everything outside blurred into a hazy streak and came to a crashing stop. My car slammed into a roadside barrier post. My head whiplashed sideways and cracked against the window. I blacked out and came to only seconds later. My headlights cast into an open field across the road. In the distance, a brown bear scrambled off into the dark. That's what I almost hit. I moved my arm to feel the side of my head. I moved my arm. I couldn't move. I tried turning my head. Nothing. I tried breathing. Nothing. I tried moving my eyes. With great effort, I glanced to the left, then to the right. I know you're here. A strange, but mother-in-law voice echoed in the car. You ducker. Concussion. I told myself. I hit my head. And these are just the symptoms. I couldn't smell anything either, or hear anything, other than the voice. I forced my eyes down to the steering wheel. It wasn't my steering wheel, and those weren't my hands gripped around it. This wasn't my body. I was trapped behind somebody else's eyes. A silent passenger, like that Malkovich movie. It felt like I was wearing somebody else's face like a mask. All the while, my senses fading in. Sound first. The sound of torrential rain beating down against the windshield. Howling wind as it gusted through midnight fields. Then, the sound of breathing. Not my own breathing. The breathing of whoever I was trapped inside. Smell faded in next. Whiskey and vanilla flavored smoke. One of the hands reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. Cold blue eyes stared back at me. It was Paul. He looked younger. Early 40s maybe. Welcome back, he said, slurring his words, staring at himself through daughter-in-law-aided pupils. He was talking directly to me. Paul coughed and rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. Pressure squeezed against me like a crushing vice. He smacked his forehead with the palm of his hand, and a jolt of pain shot through me. He hit himself again and again and again, each impact more painful than the last, until finally he stopped. Paul readjusted the mirror, shifted back into drive, and pulled onto the road. Frantic window wipers struggled to keep the rain at bay. I could feel everything now. The rumble of the highway, the taste of booze and tobacco, even blood. I was paralyzed. With what little control I had, I forced Paul's vision downward. He tapped the brakes and swerved into the opposite lane, then swerved back. Don't ducking do that, he mumbled. And then another voice entered. Just keep driving, you're almost done. It was Paul's voice again, but different this time. Not slurred. Keep ducking driving. You're almost there. I was hearing his thoughts. Maybe hearing wasn't the right word. I was feeling them, almost as if they were my own. But they stuttered in and out, like a bad radio signal. Up ahead, on the side of the road, something bright green, a bright green bike. I forced Paul's eyes to look and he swerved. The car slipped into a tailspin and sideswiped into something. 2 sickening thumps, and the car slammed bumper first into a roadside barrier post. Paul's head snapped forward into an exploding airbag and darkness. Drip. I was trapped behind somebody else's eyes now. I could feel their thoughts, but this was no ordinary thought stream. It was a dripping fractal of swarming thought streams all battling for control. Like 1,000 tortured minds forcibly melded into one. Eternal anguish. Random memories jumped out from a subconscious mess like a bubbling swamp. Correct. One step. Idiot. Mason. Stupid ducking idiot. This was a soul forever damned to an eternity of paralyzed chaos and suffering. This was the intruder. I knew it. I could feel their feet now, pressed against scratchy carpet. They took one step forward, then another, and another. 7 quick steps downward until they tumbled into the wall. Silence. Then, as if puppeteered from above, they slid up the wall, and rose to standing and I snapped into another person. Walking down my neighborhood street. We'd sell them to the neighbors, said a famother in lawyer voice. Pine cones. 5 cents apiece. It was Mitch. He looked to his side. And there, about 6 feet away, I stood. Mitch shook his head, and a chill went down his spine. Suddenly, I stood in front of my own door, looking up at myself. I've seen enough of those for a while. Howie's voice echoed as he rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. Darkness. I couldn't even think straight. Paul's voice echoed. Leaving. Aiden. Korek. Sal. Charm. Bastion. Korek. Father-in. Lawman. Renshaw. Petroleum. The intruder's voice echoed. Daylight. I stood outside the roadside diner, trapped behind Paul's eyes as he climbed onto a red Kawasaki motorcycle, and looked back towards the diner. Through the window, I stared at me. I was sitting in a red booth, sitting with Mitch. Darkness. Now I shuffled through random memories, upside down, barely breathing, stuck between 2 boulders. In the darkness below me, the faintest shape of a person, impossibly tucked between the rocks like a coiled up viper. The glint of dead eyes. Darkness. A backyard shed, cluttered with junk. Bleeding hands frantically wrapping wire around the shattered remnants of a coat rack. Darkness. Crawling through a tunnel. A dirt ceiling scraped against my back. Darkness. I am sorry, oh God. Paul's voice. I stepped out of a truck. Headlights cut through the night, and freezing rain showered down. Red and guts mixed with water on the pavement. And a bloody streak led up the road to a body, 50 feet away. Crawling. Darkness. The rhythmic thud of a hammer, clanging against nails. I stood at the top of the basement steps, staring at a closed door, paralyzed. Darkness. I stood in an apartment kitchen, staring out through a window towards a brick wall view. Darkness. A hospital bed in a bedroom. Mother-in-law Terry medical equipment scattered everywhere. Strained wheezing. Darkness. The smell of burnt hair and gasoline. Cold fluorescent light. A charred corpse, laying on a morgue table, mouth wide open. Darkness. A blaring truck horn. Finally, I snapped back to the present. Inches from the front of my car, a semi-truck sped by. I was parked on the highway shoulder at a 90-degree angle. The sun was rising. I was back in the present. Or at least, that's what I assumed. I looked at my hands. My hands. I clenched them shut, and opened them, collecting my thoughts. I pulled onto the highway, and drove. I had no idea what the duck just happened. I rubbed my forehead with the back of my thumb. Countless theories buzzed through my head as I drove down the highway. Fragments of scattered visions. Did Paul kill Zach in a drunk driving accident? Did Paul wire up the shattered coat rack, crawl through the tunnel, and set it back in my house? Was Paul a servant of the intruder? Was I becoming a servant of the intruder? After my clusterduck of a vision, at least a few things made more sense. Sort of. Not only was the intruder connected to its victims, the intruder's victims were seemingly connected to each other. Maybe it was some kind of hive mind, maybe it was turning people into intruders themselves. At this point, it seemed like anything was possible. It felt like I was on the verge of figuring this out, finally piecing everything together. But I'd been feeling that way for a while now. Then, I thought back to the way Paul's eyes moved outside the diner all those days ago, like somebody had jumped into his head, taken a quick look around, then jumped back out again. Now, I knew that it was me. I am the one who jumped into Paul's head, and looked towards myself. The nightmare logic of everything made me nauseous, like a carnival ride with no exits. A paradox web of chaos and madness with answers always hiding one step out of reach. Answers that only led to more questions. Questions that only led to more confusion. Above all this was yet another question. Something I know you're wondering too. Exactly who was the supposed old friend in Paul's house? The person he owed a favor? The person he was supposedly taking care of? Was it my childhood friend, Zach? Insane to even consider. I know. But hear me out. During my sporadic visions, I saw a green bike through Paul's eyes. The exact same bike my friend Zach was riding when he supposedly died. Did Paul hit him all those years ago? Did he find Zach barely alive on the side of the road, bring him back home? Was he keeping him alive to this day with his medical equipment and mother-in-law Terry training? Was Zach Paul's so-called old friend, the guest keeping Paul's intruder at bay? Did the timelines even match up? It was possible, but crazy to even consider. What are the chances? Paul happening to live across the street from me all these years later. How would the police not have found out? Maybe this entity had been involved in my life far longer than the last few weeks. Maybe the intruder orchestrated everything from the start. A conductor, leading a bizarre and dissonant symphony devoid of purpose. Now that I thought about it, there was a vague familiarity about everything. Like constant deja vu, like that feeling one gets around death. You'll know it if you've ever survived a bad car accident or faced something potentially terminal, or held someone's hand while they lay on their deathbed. You see part of the abyss. You finally realize, maybe for the first time, that at some point, you won't exist anymore. Maybe you never existed to begin with. In the words of Max Schumacher from Network, death becomes a perceptible thing, with definable features. Before all this, I never really feared death. There were times I even welcomed it, but that's easy to say when death is sitting off in the distance, caged behind bars. But when the end of everything is standing just 10 feet away, looking you in the eyes, breathing fog out its nostrils. My phone started buzzing in a cup holder, slowly spinning around as the screen lit up. Somebody was calling me. I pulled into the lot of a nearby gas station. Buster's Better Gas. I called them back. Bradley, said the voice on the other end. Brandon. Oh, Brandon. Doe. It was Howie, of course. What's up, Howie? Not much. Just checking to see if you're okay. Haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, I am fine. Just been running some errands. Oh, you weren't here last night? No. Huh. What? Well, somebody tore down your art thing. Art thing? I'd already forgotten about my excuse for the barricaded door. The basement door, he said. Whole thing's gone. Frame and all. Oh, I said, trying to sound calm. Yeah, I paid some guys to take it out. I lied. In the middle of the night. Yeah, I guess so. If that's when they showed up. I went to bed and the door was there. And I woke up. And the door was gone. I guess they were quiet, I said. The lie growing more absurd by the second. I'll say, I am a light sleeper too. He chuckled. Anyways, Howie continued, I am just calling to ask if it's cool I crash a few more weeks. I'll pay your rent once I get the money. Yeah, Howie. Don't worry about it. That's it. Yeah. See you, Brandon. Thanks again. It really means a lot, man. I hung up. Fantastic. Now the basement door was gone. So much for slowing him down. In all the chaos, I still hadn't realized my violation of Rule 8. You can leave the house, but never sleep anywhere else. The importance of this rule cannot be overstated. Looking back, that would probably explain the missing basement door and a few other things to come. My thoughts drifted back to Mitch. I knew he knew a lot more than he was letting on. I still didn't trust him, but I trusted him more than Paul. Low bar. I know. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. 5 tones rang out. Straight to voicemail. Mailbox full. I called again, same thing. I called again. 2 tones rang out. Silence. He cut the call short. Mitch was ignoring me. Time for plan B. Inside the gas station, I bought a cheap burner phone and a pack of smokes. Sure, I quit a few months back, but I needed something to calm my nerves. Besides, I'd quit again after this pack. Stop judging me. Back in my car, I lit up a smoke and called Mitch on the burner phone. He wouldn't recognize the number this way. I hated being stalkerish, but my life literally depended on it. 3 tones rang out, and Mitch answered. Hello, Mitch, please don't hang up. Silence. And then, what do you want? I am sorry I spoke with your. I stopped myself from saying dad. With the neighbor. What do you want? Repeated Mitch, losing patience. I just need to talk. One more time. In person. He sighed. I already said too much. Just keep following the rules. Ignore everything else. Ignore Paul. Mitch, please. I am literally losing my mind here. Just one more talk. What did you tell the neighbor? Barely anything. I just said, you know what? Never mind. He sighed again. 3 Baker Street. Ring me when you get here. He ended the call. Mitch lived about 40 minutes away in a small town off the interstate. One of those towns where main street's nothing but a graveyard of pre-Walmart mother-in-law shops. Survival of the cheapest. I pulled up to an old and gray concrete apartment building that looked straight out of Soviet Russia. I checked the address. This was the place. Lugging my crutches out of the back seat, I climbed out of the car and shut the door. Thanks to crashing into the roadside barrier, a heavy indent was scraped into the side of my car. Great. I double-checked my pockets. Phone check. Switchblade check. I brought my chrome switchblade everywhere now, just in case. The interior of Mitch's place looked early 70s to me. Open design. Cut down the middle. Half kitchen, half living room. Between them, a bar with rickety stools. There was something strangely mother-in-law about it. Déjà vu. Mitch looked a little better than the last time I saw him. Still tired though. Hey Mitch, I said, forcing a smother-in-law as I took off my coat. Silent. Mitch stood about 6 feet away. He strode back into the kitchen and started scrubbing dishes in the sink. I pulled the door shut behind me. Mitch scraped grime off a cast iron frying pan. His back turned to me. I walked up to the edge of the kitchen and looked around. His place was tidy, like a hotel room. What did the neighbor tell you? Said Mitch, referring to his father. A lot. You believe him? I don't know. Mitch sighed, tossed the dishes down, and turned off the sink, shaking water off his hands. He spun around and leaned back against the countertop. So what do you want from me? He said, crossing his arms. I have some questions. Some was an understatement. Okay, I didn't know where to start. Last night, I almost ran into a bear. On the number 7. I swerved, hit my head on the window. Blacked out for a second and then, you snapped into other people's minds. Saw things from the past, maybe even the future. I looked at him, surprised. Yeah, I mean more than that, but Mitch shook his head as if to say, I expected as much. What does it mean? I said, look, what you're doing right now, you being here, this whole rabbit hole of trying to find the truth. It's not healthy. The more obsessed you get, the more crazy you become. The crazier you are, the easier it is to control you. Control me? Mitch ignored the question. Stop expecting some priest or medium to come in and explain what's going on. Nobody's gonna show up and tell you how this thing spawned from an ancient curse or some other bullshit. And the only way to kill is to sacrifice a firstborn or pray to Jesus. He said mockingly. That's not what this is. You can't reason with something that doesn't think. The only thing you can do is keep following the rules and put off more time between now and. He trailed into morbid silence. If you think this is gonna end all tied up with a neat little bow, you're gonna end up severely ducking traumatized. As if I wasn't already. Mitch looked up at the ceiling, considering his next words carefully. There's a good reason I've been so vague about everything. The more involved you are, the more you know, the more you share, the more you search for answers, the more it slithers into your life, into your thoughts, your dreams, everything. Mitch rubbed his jaw. I barely escaped it myself. He looked across the room, and stared at the door behind me. I glanced back over my shoulder. There was a floor-length mirror on the door, partially obscured by my coat. After it took my dad, Mitch continued, I almost got pulled in. I started researching, investigating. That's when the visions started, like what happened with you in the car. The intruder feeds you these little snippets of random moments. All of them feel like they might be connected. Like they should have a reason. And maybe they do. But just because something has a reason doesn't mean it's a good one. What's gonna happen to me? It's already happening, said Mitch. You're becoming a servant of the tulpa or whatever it is. The worst part is you'll still feel in control. But you won't be. Soon enough, you'll start breaking into people's houses at night, leaving coat racks in the basements, trying to tell other neighbors about it. Maybe you've already done it and forgot. Then you'll be telling neighbors not to worry about it, telling them to work on themselves, telling them it's all in their head, even telling them your life got better ever since the intruder showed up. Maybe theirs will too. How do you know all this? I don't. It's all theory. At the end of the day, who the duck knows anything about anything? Who knows what this thing wants? Maybe it feeds off the chaos. Maybe it's working towards something bigger. I don't know. I don't want to. Not anymore. I wasted too many years searching for answers, believing the key to all this was always just around the corner. A satisfying revelation where everything would finally make sense. But it never came. Every answer only led to more questions, more confusion, more obsession, more suffering. How did Paul really die? Mitch grit his teeth. Then, he just stared at me, shaking his head, eyes father-in-lawed with ducat. You really want to know? When I was a kid, he said, after mom took us and moved out, a few years went by and dad started getting his life together. Stopped drinking, stopped leaving creepy notes in people's shoes, got him some good meds, etc. So mom, after some gentle pushing from my sister, calls him up, asks him out for coffee. Mitch went silent, eyes flicking back and forth across the wall behind me. That same night, after the phone call, dad gets shit-faced for no reason, drives up to the Balry Cliffs, same lookout he and mom used to go stargazing at. Mitch grimaced. So he drives full speed towards the cliff edge and slams bumper first into a barrier post. He shook his head. Believe it or not, he wasn't the first person to try and drive a car off the Balry Cliffs. City put up the posts a few months prior. Mitch pressed his tongue into the side of his cheek, thinking. So anyways, dad's still drunk as hell, passed out, face in the airbag. Mitch pushed off from the counter, stepped over to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Gas leak catches fire, dad burns alive. Mitch tapped his knuckles against the table a few times. Police said he was out cold. Didn't feel a thing. But I knew enough to know that wasn't true. I saw the corpse in one of those visions, mouth wide open. Mitch opened his own mouth to show. I am no expert, but people generally don't scream when they're asleep. Mitch slapped the table and ran his hand back and forth a couple times. So we make arrangements to sell dad's house. It's the weekend. We're moving stuff out. And then he paused, looked directly at me. There comes dad, riding a brand new motorcycle. He's all confused too. What are we doing with his stuff? You know. Mitch breathed out his nose. Said he was on a trip out of county last few months. Said he just got back. Course mom loses her mind. Hell, we all lose our minds. Dad's back from the grave and all. Mitch looked away, his eyes watering slightly now. He stamped his foot against the laminate flooring. The coroner's report, the police, everything. It's like none of it even happened. Mom was hysterical, screaming at the police station saying, they were trying to gaslight us. They weren't. But I almost wish they were. Documents never existed, at least. Not anymore. State almost took us away from her for insanity. So she stopped talking about it. We all did. Telling people you believe in ghosts lands you in an awkward conversation. Telling people your dad is back from the dead lands you in a psych ward. He scoffed. The thing that really ducked with me, aside from the obvious, was his hands. Mitch held up his hands and spread his fingers. 10 fingers. Including the one he shot off in the basement. Mitch looked at me again. This thing bent reality over us like a ducking wire. Like it bumped us into a parallel world or something. Mitch looked away again, staring at the kitchen cupboards as he spoke. Dad, or whatever replaced him, kept trying to reconnect with us. But we wouldn't have it. We moved cross country, cut off all ties. Mitch sighed. Things got a little better after that. Distance helped, especially back then. He trailed off into silence. What made you come back? My sister, Evelyn. She was convinced the intruder followed us after Dad died. After we moved. She thought it was trying to possess her, take over her thoughts. Evelyn ended up taking her own life a few years back because of it. Overdose. Plastic bag over the head. He trailed off. I's father-in-law with painful memories. I just wanted to find a way to stop this. Make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. I am sorry. Mitch's mother-in-law sadly and gave a little shrug. So I started asking around Dad's neighborhood. Loper father-in-law. Asking if people had seen anything, heard anything about my dad. Everyone there was so ducking weird. Weird in some mother-in-law ways too. Tics like Mitch rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb to show. People forgetting random words. Their eyes lighting up randomly. And looking around as if somebody else was inside their head. Same stuff I noticed with my dad. Only more extreme. Like the thing from his basement was spreading. Taking over the whole neighborhood. Like a virus. He shifted his weight. Uncomfortable. How'd you figure out the rules? I didn't. I mean, not fully. Those were just things that seemed to slow it down. At least in my dad's case. Before we left him, I found it all scribbled up on a napkin. Dad, for all his flaws, he's really ducking smart. Logical. He would have tested things out. Experimented. Figured out exactly what the entity reacts to, doesn't react to. So the more you know, the more he controls you. Maybe. It's only a theory. And I am basically ducked no matter what I do. Mitch stepped up from the table, strode over to the kitchen sink, and stared out at a brick wall view. He sighed. Look, Brandon, I should have been more honest with you before, but you want to know the truth, right? Yes, this has been over and done with from the start. I didn't respond. Ever since you snapped the coat rack in half. He continued. It was game over. I blinked. He looked back at me over his shoulder. I didn't tell you that cause I didn't want you to panic. The calmer you are, the saner you are, the longer it takes for this thing to get a hold of you. Get a hold of me. You're becoming a part of it now. Just like my dad. Just like the neighbors. And there's nothing I can do to stop it. Mitch shook his head and looked back out the window. You should leave, he said, resting his hands onto the countertop. But I still don't. Leave, he snapped, his voice booming with surprising loudness. I shook my head, crouched back for the door, pulled on my coat, and wrapped my hand around the doorknob. Thanks for the help, I said, voice dripping with sarcasm. I turned the knob, but it was locked. Weird. I unlocked it and tried again. Still stuck. Almost like somebody was pressing their weight against it from the other side. Mitch, I said. No response. I looked into the mirror on the door. Behind me, Mitch, with his back turned, now stood in the center of the kitchen. Pin straight posture, hands covering his face like somebody playing peekaboo. And Mitch, I said, looking back over my shoulder. Suddenly, the room shifted darker, but the lights didn't go out. Everything dimmed into slow motion nightmare. Mitch's left hand shot straight up into the air, as if being pulled from above. Then his right hand, both hands straight up in the air, standing on his tiptoes now. I watched in wide-eyed horror, paralyzed. Suddenly, his arms swung to his sides, like an invisible straitjacket wrapped around him. He stood there, motionless. Then he burst into coughing, hunched over, and staggered towards the sink, rubbing his forehead as he went. You okay? I said, taking a few careful steps forward. He threw a hand back, motioning me to stay away. I did, but his desperate wheezing and coughs only grew worse. Was he choking? He thumped his chest until finally, something flew out of his mouth, and plopped into the dirty sink water. I am okay, he gasped. I am okay. I glanced back towards the door. Mitch, back still turned to me, plunged a hand into the soapy water, fishing around for whatever came out of his throat. He froze, and his eyebrows raised. Slowly, he lifted something out of the water. It was an object about the size of a chapstick, but I couldn't tell what it was from this distance. What the duck? Mitch whispered. His hand suddenly swung to his sides again. The object flew to the floor, slid across the kitchen, and slowed to a stop in front of me. It was a dismembered finger. What the duck was right. Mitch staggered back from the sink. 7 quick steps. He straightened up into pin straight posture again. Tried to speak, but only gargled whimpers escaped. Like he was being suffocated. I stepped backwards to the door, eyes darting around the room for another escape. No balcony. Too many floors up for that anyway. What the duck? Mitch screamed. What the? His voice cut off into choking mess. His throat swelled up, like something was pushing on it from the inside out. His head snapped back, forced him to look straight up at the ceiling. And then something pushed out from his mouth. Several somethings, long and wriggling, like worms, fingers with extra joints, sliding out from his mouth and wrapping around his face. Gaunt hands, unnaturally large, squeezing together as they wriggled their way out of his mouth. Like a face hugger, pig-colored skin scarred with burn marks. The same hands I saw wrapped around the coat rack all those nights ago, forcing Mitch's mouth wider and wider until the corners of his lips started to tear. Muffled, agonizing screams. Enough was enough. I spun around and shouldered into the door, using all my weight to crash into it again and again. All the while, the horrific sight behind me reflecting on the door mirror, hidden by shadows. Something barely visible, tall and fetus-like, was forcibly climbing out of Mitch's body, dripping with blood and guts, pushing what was left of Mitch's skin down like somebody climbing out of an undersized wetsuit. Disgusting. Horrific. Finally, the door broke open. I stumbled into the hallway, and slammed into the opposite wall. One of my crutches fell back into Mitch's apartment. Goodbye, crutch. I single-crutched the duck out of there. But the hallway was different now, stretching on for eternity in both directions, growing darker and darker. I didn't have the time to think about it. I just kept pushing forward, hobbling down the increasingly narrow passage. Behind me, the sound of staggering footsteps getting closer all the while. Brandon, wait. A small, whimpering voice cried out. Brandon, please, come back. No ducking way. That's when I realized the hallway's increased length was partially an illusion. A forced perspective miniature gradually getting smaller and smaller as it went. I kept pushing forward, the ever lower ceiling scraping against my head, forcing me into crouching, forcing me onto hands and knees, crawling through this ever more miniature apartment hallway as the walls, and whatever was chasing me, pulled closer, the smell of burnt hair and gasoline growing stronger all the while. Darkness. The air changed, from dry air-conditioned cool, to humid and dark. I didn't care. I just kept crawling, shuffling forward bit by bit, my back scraping against the now inexplicably dirt ceiling as I went. Up ahead, light suddenly appeared, less than 20 feet away. A room. Exhausted, I crawled faster, the sound of my own desperate breath bouncing off the walls around me. Almost there. Finally, I broke into the room and spun around. The tunnel was empty. As far as I could see, whatever had been chasing me was gone. For now, crutchless, I pulled myself to a nearby wall, slumped against it, and caught my breath, eyes locked on the dark tunnel all the while, just in case. After a few minutes of catching my breath and calming myself down, I looked around. Dirt floors, plywood walls. This impossibly shifting tunnel had led me into the back corner of a basement. But not just any basement. Paul's basement.